So I was there in the room last week for Ali Hartman's talk. Sorry, I'm not in the room today, but anyway, we will carry on. So in many ways, this does build off of, or it's related to last week's talk by Ali. So the topic I want to talk about today is kind of the role of business in supporting sustainability. So in addressing climate change and in addressing the biodiversity crisis. So as I said, I'm going to pick up on many of the themes that Ali laid out last week very ably. And the first one actually is about Ali herself, which I really think, if you were there at the talk, she really is Wonder Woman, an amazing talk and an amazing person. And we're going to need kind of the superpower skills that she displays, and not just by Ali, but by all of us to do this. So as Ali laid out, what's the need to engage with business? Well, first of all, the business sector is extremely large, powerful, and consequential. Business can move fast. Much faster than governments seem to be able to move. So it's really hard to imagine how we address the climate and biodiversity crises at the necessary speed and at scale without business playing a substantial role. Now, as Ali also talked about, there was, especially in the Q&A, should you work inside or outside the system? Some of you are familiar with the soup throwing recently at museum to raise attention to the climate crisis. So do you work outside the system? Do you work inside the system? As Ali said, and I completely agree, it's both and, right? There's the necessary, you need people inside the system to be able to navigate, to actually be able to move it, but you also need the pressure from the outside in order for it to move. There is, so I've been dealing with, more recently with big banks and corporations and, as well as with governments and NGOs. And I have to admit, there's, I realize the necessity of doing this and the real importance of doing this, but there's also some frustration. This is from a movie back several decades ago. It's a very much younger Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, but this was after Tom Hanks put Meg Ryan's business out of business. He says, "It's not personal, it's business." She retorts, "Whatever else anything is, it ought to begin by being personal." It's important to realize that the business of business is business. It's to make profit. It's not necessarily to look out for social welfare or to look out for the environment. So a real question then is, how far will business go to do what is good for the environment or for society? Last week, Ali talked a lot about, doing well by doing good. There are certainly cases where that's true, but it's not always true. This is just a cartoon about, the beauty of free market capitalism. Is it self-correcting? Climate change? Not so much. But the point that Ali stressed, and I completely agree with, is that incentives do matter. And markets are a way of providing incentives and clear signals of value. The problem is that what markets signal and what markets value is not what's important to address in terms of climate change or of biodiversity. So for economists, we would talk about externalities and public goods. And we systematically ignore and undervalue nature because they're not internalized into companies' bottom lines. Just to make this point clearly about the importance of incentives, so starting with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it was published in 2005. And this is a table on ecosystem services from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So each of the rows is a different kind of ecosystem service. And the arrows is really what I want you to, the triangles here is what I want you to focus on. Up means that the trend has been positive. There's more provision of ecosystem services through time, and the down arrows or down triangles are where they're declining. And there's a certain pattern here. First of all, you'll notice there's not many up arrows, but the up arrows are basically for things that people produce. These are commodities. People get paid to produce crops and livestock and aquaculture. The only exception here, and I'm not really sure if it really truly is an exception, is the carbon sequestration. But anyway, everything else here, if it's not marketed, it's a down arrow, and if it is marketed, it is an up arrow. More recently, I was part of the IPBES global assessment, and as part of IPBES, we did a kind of we updated what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did, talking about what is the change in ecosystem services, or IPBES notation or IPBES language. It's nature's contributions to people. Same pattern. So the orange here means that it's on global trends over the last 50 years, it's declining. Blue means that it's increasing, and across, blue and orange means it's somewhat mixed. And again, the only ones really that are blue are the ones that are commodities that are marketed. So trends over the last 50 years, huge increase in economic activity as measured by GDP, so as measured by market goods and services. Declines in the majority of nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services. And again, the ones that aren't declining, the 4 out of the 18, are really things that show up in GDP. So, my sort of shorthand for this is you get what you pay for, and you don't sustain what you don't pay for, right? So incentives matter a lot. And right now we've got a situation where there are lots of things which from a human well-being standpoint would make sense to do. It's good for society, but from a private calculation, it is unprofitable. So there's this huge range of things where, we emit too much greenhouse gases, we pollute water, we pollute air, we change land use in a way that's detrimental to biodiversity, in ways that actually, clearly aren't good for other species, but also aren't good ultimately for human welfare. As Ali talked about last week, so where are we in terms of companies, the private sector moving? And she talked about light bulbs and guidebooks, and there's a lot of guidebooks out there. There's a lot of interest, which is good, but there's a real question about whether we're making fundamental and real change at the scale that's needed. There's actually, not to pick on the private sector too much, there's parallels with government. So governments make commitments, they make pronouncements about what they're intending to do. We've had a series of, not only at national level, but at international level, we've had a series on climate change about, starting back in the Rio conference in 1992 that set up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the Paris Agreement in 2015, all saying we need to cut emissions, we need to cut emissions drastically, and we need to start. And none of them so far have really had much weight. I mean, they've gotten a lot of attention. Here's this very triumphant looking set of world leaders from Paris. It's a landmark agreement to combat climate change and to accelerate and intensify the actions and investments needed for a sustainable low carbon future. Great, but then you look at the reality, and this comes from our World in Data, but the steady march upward in terms of annual emissions. And there's really no break at 2015. Post Paris, we're still on this upward trajectory. The only break was really from COVID, and that was sort of unrelated to policy. And since then, it's gone up. Many of you may have seen the UN report from last week that said, we're higher in terms of emissions than ever. And even if we had hit Paris pledges, so you can see current policies or kind of where we're headed, much warmer, maybe even 3 degrees C or above if we kind of maintain business as usual. Even under the pledges of Paris, we're not going to hit what Paris said of 1.5 or below 2, certainly. We're sort of in the 2.5, maybe 2.7 range. And it's not clear that all the countries are actually doing what they've committed to do. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that they are not. So this was a cartoon from a couple of years ago that basically the IPCC. So the science has become clearer and clearer through time. So if you track IPCC statements, they start with very much hedged language. Well, people, the emissions of people may be causing a problem. By 1995, definitely a problem. By 2014, when number 5 was released, it's clearly attribution, and by 2019, even more serious. But it's like the scientists are saying, is anybody listening? Okay, so both the private sector and the public sector are not moving at the speed that we need them to. I'm going to talk for a little bit about, be a little more positive, like what should we aspire to? So, I said before that the private sector the private sector responds to incentives. And right now the incentives are not aligned to deal with things like climate change or the biodiversity crisis. There are plenty of tools. We know kind of how you could align those incentives and get business to pay attention to climate change and biodiversity loss. We have regulations, we have carbon cap and trade, we have payments for ecosystem services, we have taxing bads. So there's a lot of potential ways that you could kind of, quote, get the prices right or provide incentives. And with those proper incentives, business can move quickly. So if you provide the incentives, the idea would be here that, business will respond to what's needed. And if there's a carbon price on, for example, then businesses will start to economize on emissions of carbon. So if we do this right, maybe we can actually align the public and the private incentives, and again, have businesses which are effective or efficient at operations, but needing to be directed or guided by some public policies which provide the right set of signals, not just the market signals that are out there right now. There is huge interest in the private sector right now, a large and growing interest. So I've just put up several things which are kind of ongoing efforts. So the two at the bottom, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So the one on the right, the TNFD, is just they will release, they're in the process of coming up with their standards now, and we'll release them next year. The System on Environmental Economic Accounting, or SEA, is sponsored. It's run from the UN, and the UN Statistics Division are the people who collect the system of national accounts that produce GDP. And so the idea here is we're going to extend them into environmental economic accounts. The World Economic Forum, the World Council of Business Council on Sustainable Development. There are a whole bunch of activities that are kind of pushing both the public and the private sector to pay attention, to measure, and to monitor how we're doing. Also, there's interest both in parts of governments and international organizations. These are just a set of reports on the importance of kind of linking what's going on in nature back to what's going on in human systems, or in particularly on the economic system. So I already talked about Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2005. There was T, but around 2010, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. There are various reports by the World Bank, the Changing Wealth of Nations. There have been attempts to do what's called inclusive wealth reporting. So not just what are kind of marketed goods, but what's the value of natural capital, and what's the value of social capital and human capital? And can we fold in and we get a more complete picture of whether we're being sustainable or not? I'll mention the later in the talk, in a few minutes, I'll talk about the economic case for nature, which was a World Bank report that we here at the University of Minnesota helped out with. The other one I'll just mention quickly is the Economics of Biodiversity that is scooped to review. So this was initiated by the UK government, so the UK Treasury. Some of you who do climate change are probably familiar with the UK's earlier foray into the economics of climate change, also known as the Stern report for the economist Nicholas Stern. It is also a Stern report talking about the fundamental need to be doing major changes in climate policy and major reductions soon. So there's, as I said, a lot of activity here. Me personally, I'm going to be involved in something coming up again by IPBES. They're having a scoping report, an assessment of the impact and dependencies of business on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. Just laying out the fact that we know that businesses depend on nature and they also impact nature in a range of positive and negative ways. If you're interested, and I would love if people from the GUND community were interested in this, there are nominations open for the next few days for being on this. So if you're a US citizen, you apply basically to the US government. If you go to the IPBES webpage, they'll give you the details of how to do this. Or if you're interested, let me know. I will make sure that you get that you apply by November 1st. So this notion of dependencies and impacts is at the center of this. So we know that business, in a way that business is supported by the biosphere. It's not always visible. It's not always talked about by business, but it's the fundamental underlying infrastructure on which we all depend. So what are the dependencies of business on the biosphere? And what ways does business depend on nature? And then what are the impacts that it has? So what are the either pollution or carbon emissions or land use change? How does it change what's going on in the biosphere? That's really the core of what really in talking about private sector business and nature is about. This lays out actually what's going to go on in the report. So, how does business depend on biodiversity? How does it impact it? How are we going to measure this? What are the frameworks and metrics and indicators? What is the role of business or the options for action by business? And then it's not just business, but again, it's got to be also the public sector. Governments create the rules under which business operates. The financial sector, those who lend money or invest, also have an important role to play here, as does civil society. Okay, so that's all well and good, but I'm interested in knowing, how well can we measure these dependencies and impacts? And not just in biophysical terms, but how well can we translate this into terms that business leaders themselves think about, or governments for that matter. So what are the dependencies and impacts in financial terms? And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about two projects that I've been involved with through the Natural Capital Project. So the first is something called Gross Ecosystem Product. This is a paper that was published in PNAS in 2020, led by our colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And China has been very interested in coming up with a measure of kind of environmental performance. So not just GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is econ performance, but how are we doing ecologically? And there are a number of uses, a number of reasons why the Chinese government is interested in this. So showing what the contribution of nature or ecosystems are to the economy and to human well-being. How does what happens in one province or region affect elsewhere? And can we use that as a basis for compensating? So if a province upstream or upwind is providing benefits downwind or downstream, can that be used as a basis for compensating those upstream upwind provinces? And can this be used as a performance metric for government officials? So no longer would it be the case that just you grow the economy, you're viewed as doing well. Now you have to do well both in economic terms, GDP, but also on ecological terms, GEP. So the idea here is that GEP will be reported and given equal weight to GDP. There is overlap between these two metrics. So what GEP is trying to measure the monetary value, the financial value of contributions of nature to the economy. So GDP measures the things which go through the economy already or have market value. Some of the things that nature contributes, such as contributions to agriculture or forestry or tourism, go through the economy. So they're both measured by GDP and GEP. But there are many things which nature does for us, which nature does for free. It's not measured in economic terms. So flood protection, air and water purification, carbon sequestration, pollination, mental health and physical health. So there are a lot of things that could go, currently are not measured in GDP, but the goal is on GEP to measure and value these contributions of nature, which currently are somewhat invisible. So there's 4 steps in doing this. First, kind of tracking the natural capital that creates the flows of goods and services, then translating it, what are the provision of goods and services, these ecosystem goods and services. Third step is how do we price them? And then last step is aggregating them up to get a comprehensive measure of the contribution of nature. Each of these points, I could probably spend the whole gun exchange talking about, but I'm not going to because I'm almost out of time. So earlier work that we did, this is a paper was published in Science that looks at the kind of the flows of ecosystem services and where are they created across China. For this particular paper on GEP, we took a case study in Qinghai province, which is in Western China up in the Tibetan Plateau. It's the headwaters of 3 really major rivers, Mekong River, Yangtze River, and Yellow River. And so we applied various models, the INVEST model and a few others to come up with a provision of ecosystem services, where across the landscape in Qinghai are they produced, and then also tracking where are the beneficiaries, so downwind or downstream, or where did the ecotourists come from, and that's on the right-hand side here. So I'm not going to spend any time going through these numbers, but the point is, this is an exercise that we did with help of many, many researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, coming up both with the physical supplies of these services, as well as evaluating, what are the prices associated, what are the implied values of these ecosystem services. The second kind of case that I want to talk about, just in terms of can we evaluate the kind of monetary or financial importance of nature or of ecosystem services. And this is work that we did here from the University of Minnesota with the World Bank. And also, I should mention, we had also colleagues at Purdue University who played a core role in this. So in fact, at Purdue, they have developed what's called a computable general equilibrium model of the economy, tracks basically all major sectors of the economy. It's used for also thinking about trade, so between countries. So it's a global model, lots of sectors, lots of data. On the kind of more nature side or ecosystem side, we use models of ecosystem services. So here's just a simple schematic of water quality part of the model. So, we load sediments in from, say, a cornfield. Some of it gets taken up by forest between the cornfield and the stream. But anyway, we track a number of ecological processes. Rarely do models like in general, the computable general equilibrium models don't track what's going on in nature. They don't incorporate ecological processes. This project basically built or integrated the two. So we used what's the GTAP model, again, from our colleagues at Purdue. This Global Trade Analysis Project, or GTAP, has built a computable general equilibrium that is widely used, not only by the World Bank, but by many national governments and other organizations. We also used from the Natural Capital Project a set of ecosystem service models, or INVEST, integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. And then this project was really kind of gluing together, if you will, these, so that we could go from, there's an impact of what people do. Let's say they change land. We run that through INVEST, say, well, how did that change the provision of ecosystem services? Put that back into GTAP, which then evaluates, well, what difference does this make in terms of kind of market values, GDP, and so forth. Okay, so what we did then was we ran this model forward in time and evaluated under kind of business as usual. How much would GDP have declined just because of the decline in natural capital and ecosystem services? And so that's what the kind of top chart here is showing. What was interesting for our purposes, or what we were kind of surprised by, but makes sense when you think about it, is that the greatest percentage losses happen in the lowest income countries. And reason why it's not surprising when you think about it is low income countries tend to be more dependent on natural capital, so more agriculture based, materials based. So they have the most to lose in percentage terms than do high income countries, which are much more service based and so kind of less direct impact. The figures on the right show kind of roughly where the ecosystem services are playing out. And these are just three that we've included here: crop yields, timber, and fisheries impacts. And then we can also ask questions under this, once we've got this model up and running, to say, well, how does this change? How could we, like, say, have a payment for ecosystem services, and how much would that yield increases in GDP? And that's the blue. Or how much would it also lead to reductions in climate change damages as measured by the social cost of carbon? So you can see we've got, these are the large changes. These can be over $1 billion a year. Okay, so then again, you can break this out by where this happens: low income countries or middle income countries, high income countries, and under the different policies, and also kind of decompose, like, well, why is it happening in this way? Is it because, for example, under a global PES scheme that rich countries are paying poor countries or low income countries to, to maintain natural capital and therefore ecosystem services? Okay, so, I'd laid out a question. Can we measure these dependencies and impacts in financial terms? I think the answer is yes, we can. Now, there's lots of caveats and lots of things we can do better. We haven't measured all the ecosystem services, on and on and on. I mean, so the point is, of course, we can do this better, but can we do this? Yes. The real question, the one that I started with, is can business support sustainability? And again, yes, it could, but I think the important question is, will it? And in order for us to, quote, make it real, I'm just going to end with a couple of, with some, things that I think of as being really important in this. And by the way, it is important to measure those dependencies and impacts, as I've showed, but I don't really think that's the sticking point right now. I don't think this is fundamentally a science question at the moment. Okay, so I think the majority of the public must care. Now, some of that can come from science, certainly showing, for example, the impacts that climate change is already having, showing what may happen as the impacts as biodiversity declines, that can help. But, businesses respond to what the public demands. And I'll just give you a really simple example of this. So this came back, I don't know, 15 years or so ago, I was doing a lot of work on biofuels and cars. And so what this chart shows is there was a really rapid increase in miles per gallon because of the energy crisis and because there was policy, the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel efficiency. So between 1985 and the early 80s, we increased miles per gallon a lot. It's certainly possible. The engineering is all there. Following, starting from around 1985 onwards, we stagnated. We didn't do anything to increase fuel efficiency. The chart on the right shows what happens to the weight of cars. So they got a lot bigger, that we have obese cars now. And also those cars got a lot faster. People cared about bigger cars and they cared about, I want to have it go really fast, be really powerful. So all of the engineering, basically from 1985 to 2005, there was advance in engineering, but all of it went into, let's make the cars go faster and let's make the cars bigger. It was not into, let's making the cars perform better environmentally. Okay, so the public has to care. Public has to care part two, because political, quote, leaders actually oftentimes follow public opinion. There's a really nice book by Robert Putnam called The Upswing. If you're in need of something to lift your spirits, he's talking about, how do we recreate basically the magic of the progressive era of 100 years ago and get out of our increasing inequality, stagnation, divisiveness. And, so he's talking about how can we again have an upswing. But anyway, he makes the point in this book that it wasn't really policy that led, it wasn't leaders that led, it was changes in the mood of the public that really led to large changes in society. Kind of the grim news here, so this is just pulled off of a screenshot very recently of a CNBC public opinion poll. Like, what do people care about? They care about inflation. They care about the economy directly. So, if it's a time of recession, people care about jobs and unemployment. Right now, they care about inflation. Climate change is at least on the list, but it's rare for climate change to rank higher than where it is right now, which is in 6th place. Okay, so public has to care. If the public cares, then we can have public policy, and that public policy can drive business incentives. And we talked before about aligning public and private incentives. And then The other thing beyond this, which I continually am reminded of, is really the importance of the institutions, of the way the institutions run and the constraints that they face, and that this makes implementation oftentimes difficult. Even when you convince people this is important, that we need to do something, there are a lot of hurdles that need to be overcome. Some of you may be familiar, this was a famous study from McKinsey's, the consulting company McKinsey, and basically showing there were quite a few win-wins. In other words, there are quite a few things that, if you do insulation, if you change your lighting systems, not only is it good for carbon, reducing emissions, but it's good for your bottom line. So an economist would say, well, why aren't they just doing that? There shouldn't be any free lunch out there. And this looks like there is. Well, if you really look at, then you have to go in and analyze, why aren't businesses or households doing these things that should be saving them money? It's not a trade-off. We've done work like this in land use, where you're worried about both the economic returns, like to agriculture and forestry and so forth, as well as for biodiversity or for ecosystem services. We classically come up with what's called the efficiency, the frontier, efficiency frontier, that's A through H, and point I is where we are currently. There's huge gaps. So why is that? Why aren't we doing as well as we could? And it's not a question again of, oh, it's costly. It's like, no, this should actually be good. These like are win-wins. So what is it that's preventing this from occurring? What we have to pay attention to, what, kind of the nitty-gritty details. What are the roadblocks and hurdles? What are the things that we need to do in order to remove these obstacles to progress? And maybe it's just that we need an army of Allie Hartmans to do this kind of work at the speed and the scale that's required. So thank you very much.